Welcome to Solutions Cast, a podcast hosted by Innovation-AccLab Pakistan. COVID-19 has brought drastic changes in our global and local systems. While there are setbacks, we're also seeing acceleration in digitalization and local innovation. In this podcast series, we want to understand the disruptive impact of COVID-19 and also talk about local innovation and solutions that the crisis has accelerated. In our first episode, we go deeper into the current trends and disruptions that COVID has brought in Pakistan. Has experimentation increased? Is there a focus on circular economy? What are some of the futuristic trends? With the Innovation-AccLab, we explore these questions. With me, I have Binish Tahir, Head of Innovation-AccLab and Exploration Lead, Javeria Masood, Head of Solutions Mapping, and Ehsan Gul, Head of Experimentation. And I'm your host, Tabin Danver. Welcome to the podcast. Javeria, we'll start with you. You wrote a blog that presents a systemic scan of current to futuristic trends. From the lens of a designer, what are some of the emerging trends we're seeing in space of work, urbanization, and the way our healthcare system is designed?
So essentially, the lens of a designer really is that you're curious of people and patterns and behavior, and there's a strong bias towards solutions. So whenever you look at anything, you're by default, just your brain is wired to identify gaps and places where, you can intervene and identify a way forward. Yeah. So at the very beginning of the COVID, when we did the systemic scan to kind of analyze what are some of the emerging signals of disruption, few things, a lot emerges, right? So I'll maybe talk about 2-3 things. So one thing that's very evident to notice is hyper-localization. So at multiple scales, right? You see that at a macro national level scale where import and export has largely been affected because portation can cause a lot of transmission of the virus. So that had to be halted. Similarly, you're now confined because of social distancing. You're confined to just your neighborhood. So your radius is now very, very shrunk. You will go to the grocery store within your vicinity. You hardly get to see your neighbors. You hardly get to go to work. So that has largely given way to a lot of, local industries and local store owners and retail to actually get a lot of benefit from it. And I think the same trend will continue in terms of production. We're seeing that if there are products and resources that we did not have internally, and we're now seeing that we're not self-sustained in that way. So that kind of pushes us to reevaluate and then reignite some of those things. And then another thing that is very interesting and exciting to notice is the experimentation. So because, COVID came out of nowhere, there was no readiness or preparedness for it. Industries and generally people, government, everyone had to make very, very quick decisions. So, large organization had to decide literally overnight to change their work modalities. So that's an experiment within itself. We, as in the society, of course, there's future work discourse, there is, freelancing culture. But that hasn't really kicked out so much as this time has dictated. So organizations started experimenting with different work modalities. They had to change their work plans for the entire year. Experimentation under this uncertainty. We're seeing healthcare systems experimenting a lot with telemedicine, with distance consulting. The government has been very, very quick in some of the responses, where you see that there's new emphasis on social welfare. There's new emphasis on creating models of support, whether that is through micro loans, microfinancing, or re-employing people through the green stimulus program. So you see that essentially if you follow the cycle of policy or change, it's very, very slow. But in this case, because there was no time and a large accountability aspect, So people very quick to even pivot their thing. So government would try something and it didn't work, they would, the next day kind of change it in a different way. So this experimentation lens is very interesting, and I hope that it retains itself once we're behind all of this. And the third thing I'd like to point out is behavior. So people are generally super adaptive. Whatever comes our way, we have a fight or flight or whichever response. But in this case, even just as Pakistani society, we're largely conformed by our social structures. All our choices are determined by what our social pressures are, what people around us are saying. So now, when we're not meeting our families so often, it's kind of strange to see some quality time interaction expanding, and then some interactions completely becoming non-existent. So it's interesting to it would be interesting to see how these things, whether they leave a long-term footprint. Will this change the way that we interact with each other? Will this change our expectation from our friends and family? So there are a lot of these kind of emerging trends that we're looking to surface. And COVID has in a lot of ways, acted as a disruptive element. So if we wanted innovation in an organization and adaptability, COVID just came in and kind of took care of that. In the same way, we're seeing a huge scope on future of work. We're seeing our healthcare systems being much more adaptive and much more resilient, and priorities in terms of policy being shifted. So these are some of the things that one can see.
Definitely, I agree. COVID has created a scope for future of work. Thank you, Javeria. We're seeing an increasing trend of digitalization in the government in Pakistan. An example being the telehealth portal that maps and provides employment opportunities to people. Vinesh, my question to you is, does this increasing trend of digitalization in public sector mean that we're well on our path to have an inclusive innovation policy for startups?
So I think it's really important to sort of place this question within its context, right? So pre-COVID, and all of our discussions now will always be pre-COVID and post-COVID, what happened. And now post-COVID, yes, we're seeing increasing digitization. We see it in the ESAS program, the emergency relief program for the most vulnerable. We see telehealth, something that is actually taking over world over. I also saw an app for citizens to use in Islamabad for various government services. So there's a lot of those attempts taking place. I think there was already an effort from government for the last 5 years or so to develop and enhance the ecosystem for digitization of services. There was, just before last year, at the end of November, we had the Digital Pakistan launch. Again, this was a very intentional policy to drive tech solutions. We also had the Ignite Fund, where they have funded many startups using tech specifically and also incorporating the SDGs. And then we've had the national incubation centers, where in this ecosystem, you've had startups developing various solutions largely around tech and using digital services. So we've already had that ecosystem building. And it's actually been really, thank God that work was being done, and that the government had already understood what a startup is and what they can potentially do. Yeah, so there's a point where now post-COVID, I'm not so sure what are the next steps in terms of making inclusive innovation policies, because the same issues of before remain. it is still hard to set up a startup. There is still no understanding of what a social enterprise is. Now with COVID, there is even more emphasis for a circular economy, which means you need sustainable businesses. Being sustainable and creating a business that is that has very little waste is already sort of taking up that social enterprise space, right? So now this is no longer even the responsibility of social enterprises, it's startups, businesses, etc. So how is the government going to create a regulatory system, a policy system for these startups to scale eventually? It's still heavy. That needs to loosen up. Maybe it will after what the startup ecosystem has done. But I also want to expand on what inclusive innovation can mean, right? It's not only just digital technology. It is also embracing inclusive innovation can embrace the local solutions coming up from communities. There might be lead user innovators, right? People who have suffered, for example, a health issue, and they've created their own solutions out of it. Or in the rural communities, there might be local, jugaad solutions that they're coming up with. So we also have to expand what we mean by inclusive innovation. It's not just the techie startups. There are broader innovations happening across the country that can be included in policy as a solution. And it might be more inclusive in that way and more effective to do it in that way. So I think the hope is that after the government is having to be very experimental, working very rapidly with new innovative solutions, that this understanding of being innovative becomes mainstream. And it's just the way we now do work. And we continue to find more and more innovative solutions to come into policy making. And that policy making is not just the few experts sitting at the table, but that we continue to have platforms like Digital Pakistan, NIC, and more to bring local solutions together.
Yes, I agree. There is broader innovation happening in the country, and there is hope that local innovation becomes part of policy as solutions. And I see that the emphasis globally for a circular economy. Thank you, Binish. Ehsan, as an experimenter, what has been some of the interesting ways of finding local solutions from the innovation ecosystem?
Thank you, Tabinda. I'll just echo what Javeria and Bina said that yes, it's a vibrant or disruptive time where COVID has played a role. But I would also say the power of community has really come forward. Yes, we already had an identified innovation community, or the government itself was thinking of ways through Digital Pakistan or other ways they wanted to mobilize the ecosystem, entrepreneurial ecosystem. But I feel like much more than that, we can right now see the sense and the solidarity of the community coming together and working on giving spaces to people to think differently. Like, for instance, the moment when we saw ventilators are of a need for COVID patients, and it was a growing need. Nobody knew that ventilators were the medical equipment required most. We saw Facebook groups, open source documents, people sharing, engineers coming forward, investors coming forward, even medical technologists coming forward. And there was a sense of community, people coming together, right? Similarly, there was this need, and like all the innovation ecosystem was like, how do we really get to the nuggets of these local solutions? How are people thinking differently? And one technique was that you saw multiple national level, provincial level hackathons happening, one supported by the Ministry of Health and National Incubation Center, and UNDP also supported that hackathon. Other than that, we did one on disaster risk reduction with the National Disaster Management Authorities. So there were multiple of these, and few I even don't know, right? Because they might just be happening at the local level. But then that's the beauty of the process, where you let go of the, what we say, rather than government clinging on to who decides to make which solution would work, give the power to the community, let it go granular, let it go at the grassroots level. And we saw all these ideas coming forward. One such example is yesterday, I don't know, I haven't talked to those people, but on Instagram I saw something called My Udan. And there is this committee system, a financial system, informal way. Our household women and many men now also put committees, and like, for people who are listening from the global audience, committee is actually a local way of trading money within households, but
It's like a
then who needs it?
savings, yeah, it's like a
Yes,
savings
it's a
method
saving
that,
mechanism.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And then let's say Javeria needs it in 1 month, we all give it to her, and next month the cycle goes. And it's called My Udan, and it is a digital solution where they are actually creating a digital committee system just to help people who are suffering from COVID. So it was smart, and the line they had written on their Instagram, we are prototyping. I loved it. As an experimenter, I jumped. I was like, I need to talk to these people. So you can see that even, I don't know, those people have studied innovation, experimentation. Are those people who are from this community of ours? Maybe they're just people who realize that there is a need for a local solution to a real pertinent problem. The biggest pain right now is economic and financial inclusivity of these people. But then I got a call from a friend yesterday. She works in one of a partner organization with UNDP, and she was like, we work with women entrepreneurs and women marginalized groups, and they have come to realization that they've been moved or pushed more into vulnerabilities because of COVID. And one of a bigger learning question for them right now to explore is how to make them digitally and financially inclusive. And she was like, what do we do? It's the infrastructure and the system which is not helping us come up with the right ideas. It's the system, then the blame goes on. But who is in the system? So you kind of see these germs of human-centered design or systemic thinking, or you name it. People are thinking that way. They might even don't know, but then the COVID has made them realize that it is much more than just one linear solution. It is the system together which we need to rethink. And I feel like, coming back to your question, yes, the ecosystem has somehow sprouted a little of those seeds right now, where grassroots local innovation is coming forward. So yeah, so COVID definitely is a disruptor in a positive way for at least the innovation community.
Yes, COVID is definitely a disruptor in a positive way for the innovation ecosystem. Thank you for your time, Beenish, Javeria, and Ahsan. It was great having you on the show. To our listeners, thank you for listening. This is Solutions Cast, hosted by Innovation-AccLab Pakistan. Watch our space for more.